It's exciting, it's a little bit dangerous, and it's personally cost Rob Bence a lot of money. What is it? Well, it could be a lot of things, but in this context, we're talking about buying property off plan. Yes, welcome to the Property Podcast. This is episode 266. I'm Rob D, and on the podcast today, we're going to be playing you an episode that we first broadcast all the way back in October 2013, where we were talking about off-plan property. We've mentioned this topic on Ask Rob and Rob a couple of times, but it's still something that we get loads and loads of questions about. And with the property market starting to heat up in cities like Manchester and Liverpool, lots more off-plan deals coming to the table, and lots of hubbers like you asking themselves if it's something they should be getting involved in. So in this episode, we talk about the benefits of buying off-plan, why you'd want to do it in the first place, what the risks are, and how you can mitigate those risks. You're also going to hear Rob B's personal off-plan horror story, but let's start off with the very basics by defining off-plan.
To start with, let's talk about what off-plan property actually is. Off-plan property is really simple. All it means is you're buying a property that hasn't been built yet. You're buying it off the plan. It's a property where a developer is building often a housing development or a block of flats, and they're selling it to you before it's actually completed and ready to buy. We're going to talk about the benefits of it and why it's such a hot topic. We're also going to talk about the risks and what you can do to protect yourself if you invest in off-plan property. That is something that we really do need to talk about because, Rob, you know a heck of a lot about this kind of thing, and you've personally lost money on this stuff.
Yeah, I have. I've worked with investors on off-plan property, but I've learned from my experiences. I've personally lost money on off-plan property myself in the UK, I might add. I've got to be careful because the company is still around. They used to be just a developer, and now they are a property investment company. So I can't name them. They're based in Manchester, and I can't say much more than that. But if you do your research, you might find out who it is. But basically, this company put a deal together that was really, really good. It was a sensational deal. The deal itself was in Manchester as well. It looked really strong. The solicitors looked over the contracts. It looked, on paper, tickety-boo. And then it turned out, further down the line, that the company claims they didn't even own the land and they couldn't do anything about it, offered to refund the money back, which I still haven't had, and this is 4 years later. I actually think they realised they'd given too good a deal away and wanted to renege on the deal, and that's what I do believe that actually happened. The reason why I'm telling you this is not to scare you off-plan property, but it's to make you aware that you can lose money. Now, on the flip side, I know some people who've made vast sums of money from off-plan. But if I can lose money on off-plan, and I've worked in property investment for a long time, so can you. The lessons I'm going to give you today are first-hand lessons and experiences I've gathered myself. Hopefully that if you invest in off-plan, you can take advantage of the upsides, but not be exposed to the risks or the downsides.
Okay, well, let's talk about those upsides then. So if there is all this risk, then why is it worth considering? Well, the benefits, as I understand it, Rob, and you might want to jump in on this as well, is that, first of all, there's a potential to get a particularly good deal. You can get something below market value, as people say. The reason for that is that developers, for cash flow reasons, are keen to make some sales. They want to get some money in the bank, so they might offer you an incentive to buy early. Also, you're being rewarded, I suppose, for your risk. So because you're buying something that doesn't exist yet and you're going to have to wait, you'll be getting a discount for that. And developers also want to have a strong start to sales so they can sort of do all their marketing and say how it's almost sold out and this many units have gone and all that kind of thing. There's a potential to get a good deal. There's also the benefit of leverage, because when you're buying off plan, what you typically do is put down a 10% deposit and you pay the rest when it's actually complete, whether that's 6 months down the line or whatever. The reason that gives you leverage is if you put down a 10% deposit and by the time the building's completed, the market has gone up by 5%, then on paper, you've got a 50% return on the money you've put in. That's even more leverage than you normally benefit from just by using mortgage finance, as we've talked about before. So that means that in a rising market, off plan is pretty great. It means you get to make these big returns before you even had to pick up the keys. In a booming market where things might be sort of getting toppy and about to come down the other side again, it can be risky. So have I understood that correctly?
Yes, absolutely, Rob. You've nailed it. It's really down to two major things for me. The potential to get a good deal and the leverage aspect. The leverage aspect is huge. It shouldn't be underestimated. There can be serious wealth created if you get it right. Some people also buy off plan and then sell on completion as well, because they've made a profit. I know a lot of people who've done that. Not my personal preferred strategy, but I know it's worked for some other people. I know other people who've lost doing that as well. So, I'll caveat it with that. Okay, so let's look at the risks. So what could go wrong? Well, the developer could go bust. You've bought into off plan and suddenly the developer disappears. Well, it's going to stay off plan for permanently. It's not going to go anywhere. You might get it rescued. Someone might take over the build, but you might not get the same deal again. You might lose your money. It is a risk. So the developer could go bust. That's probably the biggest one and the biggest fear for most people when it comes to off plan. The market could crash. You could buy a property and it's due to complete a year later, and 6 months later, the market crashes. You still have to buy. So a lot of people during the last boom bought property and then they got to the stage where they're about to complete and the market fell down. So it dropped by 20%, whatever it was. Suddenly the off-plan property was worth less. The price stayed fixed. It was now worth less. So they had to put more money into the deal, and some people couldn't. They only had enough just for the basic deposit. So it put them at risk. That could happen as well. And finally, you might not be able to get finance. That could be a risk as well. So the developer going bust, the market could crash, and you may not be able to get finance. The mortgage market might change between now and when you complete. Although that all sounds pretty scary, as I said before, I've learned, and my direct experiences have helped me to minimize the risk when it comes to off-plan property and maximize the gains. So one of the first things you can do to minimize the risks, developer going bust. Well, what can you do? There's a couple of things. First of all, a lot of developers use the NHBC certificates on. You'll see the flags outside a lot of new builds, NHBC. What most people know it for guarantees the build of the property for 10 years after it's complete. That's a great thing to have. Fantastic. But what people don't know is that NHBC guarantee will protect the 10% deposits as well during off plan if it's in place. If your development has NHBC protection, your 10% deposit is protected as effectively insured. And if the developer goes under, then they will pay out. Now, they only pay up to 10%. So if you're asked to put a 20% deposit and the developer goes bust, you'll only get 10%. You only want to leave up to a 10% deposit if you're using the NHBC to minimize your risk. Okay, so that's one way. And that's probably one of the more common ways. Another way is if the developer's prepared to put the deposit in escrow. Now, this is rare because if a developer is willing to put their money in an escrow, they're not getting their hands on it. And most developers give a deal because they want the cash flow, they want the money in now. But it does happen. I've done a deal recently. It's all sold now. It was in Kent. It was a fantastic investment. And the developer was so cash rich that they held the money in escrow. They only wanted the deal to go through in the beginning for marketing purposes. And then once we sold a few for them, we tried to do more on the same terms and they wouldn't allow it because they were selling on site. So we were a bit unhappy that we couldn't get more. However, the investors who bought in that, lucky them. However, they held the money in escrow. That is the most secure way to look after your deposit. So that's how to protect yourself from the developer going bust. The next is the market could crash and you still have to buy. Well, as Rob's already said, you should never buy in a heated market. What I'm saying is you buy in a rising market, but don't buy in a heated market where everyone's going crazy. When there's a property program on every night of the week, it's going crazy. And finally, you can't get finance. Well, this is where you work with experts, mortgage brokers. Some brokers will look at the products and they'll say, yes, we can get you a product, or no, we can't. What you want is there's brokers out there that are really good, but there's some that find problems and there's some that find solutions. You want to find the type of broker that's going to look into every nook and cranny to make sure that they can find a product for you. And that's the type of brokers we work with at RMP. We've got a 100% record of getting people financed. So it doesn't mean that you will, especially if you're doing this alone. Make sure you speak to a broker. And if they say no, maybe speak to two more. They may be a good broker, but they may have not spotted something. So try a few before you rule yourself out of the market. That's the risks, but that's how you minimize them as well. So if you do that, then you can look to take advantage of that huge leverage and the below market value aspect, which a lot of people make money from.
That's a hell of an overview. I didn't even realize that a 10% deposit would be protected by the NHBC. One of my fears would have been the developer going bust, but clearly that's not such a problem as long as you've got your wits about you and you go with a scheme that's covered by the NHBC. It seems like the main danger is just kind of piling in an overheating market without thinking. I suppose as well, Rob, the fundamentals are really important as well, because I can imagine in the last boom, there'd be buildings going up all over the place, lots of deals being offered on paper, which made a lot of sense. But then it would turn out to be, 5 miles away from any kind of schools, shops, transport or anything else. And then when things start going down the other side again and the market isn't as exciting, they're going to be the hardest properties to sell, the hardest properties to rent out. I would assume that if you protect yourself against the risks as you've talked about and keep in mind all the fundamentals as we always talk about, then maybe off-plan isn't quite as risky as it's sometimes made out to be.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Rob. Don't ignore all the other things we talk about. Everything else we've said over the last 30-odd episodes stands true. Include all that when you look at off-plan property. You just have to include a little bit more.
So there you go. Hope you found that useful. Off-plan's one of those topics that you get a few of in property. It's like houses versus flats and interest only versus repayment. People tend to get very tribal about this and say, oh, I would never buy off-plan. Well, other people are all too happy to tell you about the massive gains they've got by buying off-plan, and they absolutely love it. As with any of these, it's not so clear cut, and I think Rob summed it up perfectly at the end when he said it's all your normal due diligence and a little bit more. So just because there's a glossy brochure attached doesn't mean that you're exempted from doing all your normal research. You do everything that you'd normally do, and then you ask yourself those extra questions that we ran through, like looking into the developer's track record and how the deposit is going to be protected. So hope you found that useful. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back, of course, next Thursday, and if you can't wait that long, there's Ask Rob and Rob on Tuesday. Until then, have a great week. Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to The Property Podcast. For show notes, all our past episodes, and to leave a review, go to thepropertyhub.net/podcast.